أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin as always in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I apologize that I don't speak Flemish or French, so I will try to speak carefully in English because I'm very excited about this topic, and also because just a few months ago I presented my first paper on this topic, and I had 45 minutes and I took 55 and I never got through all my pages. So I will not even bring the paper out. What I want to talk about actually has to cross over both time and space. But as a theologian, ultimately I want to make its relationship to the system of Islam. And it's been called Islamic feminism. And this is actually a fairly recent term. And the way to arrive at it, I think, is to take you a little bit on the journey that I myself have been on, because I have been engaged in Islam and gender thought for 40 years, and it's only been 5 years that I recognize myself as an Islamic feminist. So how did I get there? I think I will start with 1995 with the Beijing conference, because the presence of Muslim women at the International Women's Conference in Beijing was very overt, very noticeable. And at some point along the way, we decided that we should get together to form a caucus, a Muslim Women's Caucus. And all they did was shout at each other, because different perspectives were coming together and they had not learned a language to mediate between these differences. The two loudest voices, and the two voices that had the most support, both within their own nationalities and internationally, were the two voices that I need to bring into conversation to help you to see about the evolution of Islamic feminism. Now I'm going to talk then about 3 strategies for Muslim women's reform, starting with these two voices. But in reality, of course, there is much greater diversity. So on the one hand, I would say we have the Islamist voice. And the Islamist voice is connected with the political Islam agenda. Most notably, that agenda says, if we just implement Sharia, our lives as Muslims would be perfect. On the other hand, the other very loud voice is characterized by a kind of secular feminism, because it is important in their perspective of gender reform that we leave religion out of the debates. Clearly there is not an easy meeting point between these two voices, but also I want to say a little bit more about the evolution of each of the voices. Because if you look in Muslim majority countries, a radical change in our whole ummah, our whole global community, came about in the 20th century with the end of the empire. And the end of the empire for many nations, and not just Muslim majority nations, but for many nations, the end of the empire was the beginning of colonialism. We were not introduced to the nation-state idea, which is the current reality. We were not introduced to it without a very negative imperialistic thrust. Some countries wanted to tell the world how to be their own nation-states. And this is the way in which Muslim countries came into the nation-state phenomena, so of course there was some resistance. And the name of that resistance was called nationalism. And in Muslim-majority countries, as well as in Latin America, which is predominantly Catholic, the nationalist agenda articulated for these new broken down entities exactly what would be the nature of their own polity, their policies, and their citizenship. Women and men stood side by side to establish their own national identities, but the end result and the clear demarcation of at least many of the nation states, because as recently as last year, I think we're still having new ones, the clear demarcation of the nation states came into being without women necessarily being the beneficiaries to the same extent as the men along whose side they had fought. In the context of Muslim-majority countries, this created for many women a clarity that the matter of gender had to be addressed specifically and directly, and not simply subsumed under the notion of citizenship. Because what actually happened at the beginning of the nation state is that women were not equal citizens in their own newly formed or articulated or clarified nation state. Take, for example, today. I was just in Jordan last week, and if a Jordanian woman marries someone other than a Jordanian man, her children will not be Jordanian citizens. They cannot hold a Jordanian passport. But if a Jordanian man marries anybody from anywhere, his children will be Jordanian citizens and can hold a Jordanian passport. So you see, the notion of the citizen was not necessarily equally dished out to women and men. And this is the beginning of women's activities in the context of the Muslim world that leads to the modern era. Women began to form organizations, intellectual culture clubs, and to also educate themselves to be able to participate fully in the benefits of their new nation states. So we're talking late 19th century, early 20th century. Now, when Muslim women were advocating in this time, they would advocate on behalf of women's rights for things like universal education, for access to public health, obviously to citizenship rights and the like. They did so as Muslim women, but they also did so because, at least at a level of upper and middle class, they were themselves becoming educated, and they were also aware that the culture in which they were born, which includes Islam, was not the only culture in the world. I call this part of the global perspective. The global perspective is extremely important to us today because our world is interconnected. Everything that we do in one place has an effect someplace else. And not only that, we are hopefully coming to a point where we understand that we are citizens of one planet. So the global perspective actually examines the position of citizens not only in your own nation state, but in other nation states, to determine what might be the global definition of a citizen. Is a citizen in Belgium more a citizen of Belgium than a citizen of Jordan? If a Belgian woman marries someone who is not from Belgium, can she pass her citizenship to her children? I don't know. I'm just asking a question. Somebody can, okay. So in other words, a woman in Jordan and a woman in Belgium are part of the global arena, but you don't have the same rights in your own nation state. So these women were aware in the early part of the 20th century that the whole world did not operate along the same lines. And so they benefited from suffragist movements and women's rights movements in other parts of the world, but they weren't necessarily claiming it for the sake of other women. They were claiming certain things for themselves. And sometimes they used Islam as a motivation for what they were advocating. But sometimes they would advocate against the most common understanding of Islam, or the ones that were being used to establish certain unequal laws within the nation state. Margot Badran calls this the first wave of Muslim women's feminism. Now, my attaching to this, for the sake of my argument, secular Muslim women's feminism, I don't think was relevant in the early part of the 20th century. That had to wait until the end of the 20th century and the rise of Islamism. And the rise of Islamism, as I said, is a political movement to establish an ideal of Islam. It's an ideal that never really existed because Sharia has never been an implementation. Sharia is a concept, it's a value. Technically, it comes from the word that means path. And the word street, Sharia, comes from the same root. It is a path that leads to water, and water being the source of all life. So Sharia is the divine way. Muslims have always striven to live in the divine way, but they knew that the way to adjudicate that divine way was to establish an understanding of the primary sources, the Quran, which is revelation from Allah, the Sunnah, the established practices of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Hadith, the statements that have been transmitted on the authority of the Prophet as well. But what they did to understand this divine way should be called fiqh. Fiqh is juridical understanding of the divine way and is 100% human-made. Might I add, it's 100% man-made in the way in which I will describe it for the moment. When the Islamist movement took root in the latter part of the 20th century, it was hoped that somehow a resolution to the empiricism of the West with regard to the phenomena of the nation state would be defeated by referring to a system that was higher, because of course it was related to belief in God, that was higher, that was older, but at the same time that was authentic to the Muslim person. That was the goal. The problem is the articulation of what is this Islamic way had not only been filtered through 1,000 years of fiqh, but also had been incorporated into concrete laws at the time of colonialism itself, where the fuqaha, those people who give legal opinion, used to make decisions based on their knowledge of the Quran, of the Sunnah, of the Hadith, and of their own locations. They did so with a certain spontaneity, eclecticism, and genuine relationship to the community. They didn't do so on the basis of codes that went into place around the time of colonialism. You can ask me about this later. I'm just trying to give you an idea that fiqh was much more complicated, much more appropriate to the daily lives of the people who were using it than what the Islamists understand it to be. The Islamists have a frozen notion of some perfect Islam which never existed, because Islam was always alive and always engaged in the dynamism of life. So there was nothing fixed. But after colonialism, certain laws, particularly Muslim personal status laws or family laws, became fixed. They became codes. And then those codes were taken to be Islamic. So the high point of the Islamist movement was the Iranian Revolution, because then Islam won out, whoever it was who articulated this Islam. And around that same time, many Muslim women who had been active in the nation-state building stage of their own nation states articulated a different perspective with regard to women's freedoms, liberations, identity development, spirituality, etc., and decided that they did not want whatever it was the Islamists were advocating, and if what the Islamists was advocating was indeed Islam, then they didn't want Islam. So secular feminism was not born at the first wave of Muslim women's activism. It was born after the rise and the signs of success of Islamism itself. By the time we get to the conference in Beijing in 1995, the Islamists are there, and they are represented coincidentally at a women's conference, mostly by men, who are handing out literature explaining the wisdom behind Islam's decisions about A, B, and C. And the secular feminists galvanized their support behind the international instruments of human rights from the UN. Instruments like CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And they were also vociferous in their articulations. They were strongly supported by the international community because this was the language the international community understood. And what arose at that time, clearly in my mind, was the articulation either or. Either you have Islam or you have human rights. The Islamists said, well, of course we want Islam. Islam is going to be better than anybody's notion of human rights. And the secularists said, we need to get rid of Islam because we have to have human rights. Most Muslim women in the world did not fall into these two camps, despite how articulate they were, despite how much funding support they had. And there we were. I came as a member of Sisters in Islam in Religie, an organization that's now 20 years old. There we were in the middle, with no methodology, no objectives, but a clear and intuitive sense that neither one of these sides represented us. And so we began to develop a methodology and a set of objectives, and we began to network until we were clear what the problem was. And what the problem was, both the term feminism and the term Islam needed to be interrogated. Whose Islam? Whose feminism? The resources that we used in our re-articulation, particularly of Islam, was to establish a direct and intensive critical study of our own tradition. To do so from a manner which was explicitly gender sensitive, gender inclusive, women's voices, women's perspectives, women's ways of knowing. In the end, it was very clear that the Islam that was at the table was the Islam as articulated within a patriarchal rubric, which certainly had sanction in more than just that 1 century, but was not necessarily the exclusive way to articulate Islam, because alongside the patriarchy of the Islamic message was also the egalitarian message. The two coexist, even, for example, in the articulations of the Quran, in the Quranic revelation. Why? Because the Quran was revealed to real people, living in a real context. 7th century Arabia, where they had slaves, where they had multiple wives, where they buried female infant children alive. And the Quran addresses that particular situation while simultaneously establishing a trajectory of human equality unparalleled at that time. The whole idea behind the United Nations, by the way, just in case you have forgotten, since it started over here in Europe with the wars of the previous century, the whole idea behind the United Nations was, we have shown that as human beings, we can do things to violate the honor and dignity of other human beings just because we're at war with them. Some of the atrocities that were committed by human beings against other human beings, we collectively decided were just not a good thing. So we wanted to establish rights that a person deserved to have, no matter if they were friends or enemies. The UN did not come out of midair. It came out of World War I and World War II. But the UN was not the beginning of the conversation about what it means to be a human being. All the spiritual traditions, all the philosophies had already articulated what it meant to be a human being. And in my tradition, in our tradition as Islam, we also have notions about what it means to be a human being. Fundamentally, according to the Quran, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I'm going to create on the earth an agent. The human being is a moral agent of the will of God on the earth. That's the fundamental understanding of a human being from the Quran. There is no understanding of a female human being that is different from the understanding of a male human being. All of that was constructed later when people said, well, what does it mean in our context? And most of these contexts, just like the rest of the world, were patriarchal. So if the Quran has established unconditionally that my right as a human being, which is to believe in and worship God, is no different from any other person's right, why would there be a set of laws that would subsume me under a secondary status? We know why there would be laws that would do that. But the problem was, why would they say that in Islam? Have you ever heard this? In Islam, a woman can't drive a car? I remember the first time somebody said it to me. I married that guy, by the way, but... Now I'm going to fast forward just a little bit because I think I've set this up well enough. On September 11th, something happened that was really a tragedy for me personally as an Islamic studies scholar and as a Muslim. But that was also very important for this conversation with you today. And that is that certain acts were performed, certain heinous acts were performed in the name of Islam. It became even more important for many Muslims to figure out whose Islam blew up trade centers, slaughtered people on the street here in Europe. Whose Islam was that? And as soon as you ask the question, whose Islam, then you begin to realize that Islam is no fixed thing, even as a Muslim. Of course, I live in the United States, let me be frank, and our response to those events was to go into war. So you guys had your turn, and so the United States, I guess, was feeling a little bit underrepresented. So, you know, now we're fighting in Iraq, and now we're fighting in Afghanistan. But what also happened with these two invasions in the name of freedom, justice, democracy, and liberating Muslim women was an even more critical necessity for distinguishing whether or not Western feminism truly represented all women of the world. And guess what? It did not. But once you problematize both the word Islam and the word feminism, then you began to have agency over both terms. It was clear from the work that we had been doing before we went to Beijing. It was clear that we took agency of our own identity as Muslim women. But what we had not done is taken agency over the definition of Islam. And once we took agency, which is very simply this: Islam belongs to us. We make this religion as we live it. And if we are motivated, as am I, from the Quran's own message of ultimate human unity, the unity that you achieve from Tawheed, and if from that message we are inspired to challenge any laws, any policies, any practices, any individuals, even members of our own family, that establish for us a role in our own homes, in our own societies, in our own nation states, that is anything less than the full agency given to us by Allah, then it is our duty under that agency to challenge those practices, those policies, those attitudes. Thus was born Islamic feminism. Islamic feminism doesn't need anything from the West in order to move forward with the reforms that we are talking about. The reforms that we are talking about would actually challenge a policy in Jordan that gives citizenship to the sons and daughters of a Jordanian man married to a non-Jordanian woman, but would not give citizenship to the sons and daughters of a Jordanian woman married to a non-Jordanian man, because they are both equal citizens of Jordan and equal creatures before Allah. Once we remove the impediment from establishing justice and equality, once we were clear that nothing ever happened to deny women their full and equal human dignity in the name of Islam, but rather in the name of Muslim interpretation and implementation of Islam, then it was possible for us to claim a name for ourselves, which was Islamic feminism. Thank you.